Now there is absolutely no denying that natural baits will get you bites in carp fishing all the way throughout the year, but they really come into their own as the water starts to cool down. The fish have been heavily pressured throughout the summer months. Adding naturals into your mix can really turn your session around. But with natural baits also comes its problems. First and foremost is keeping them and knowing how to keep them. Secondly, it's knowing what rigs to use them on and how to use them properly on rigs. And thirdly, it's how to apply them out into the water. And in this tips-based video, I'm going to pass on all of the things that I have learned over the years of how to get the most out of natural bait, and more importantly, to help you guys put more fish on the bank when it comes to applying naturals into your carp fishing. So when would I use naturals? I would use them any day of the year. A lot of people tend to go more towards the naturals, like I've already said, when the water starts to cool down. I know when the water is a lot warmer, all of the smaller fish, your rudd, your roach, your bream, your tench, your eels, are a lot more active within the lake. But I've always sort of lived by the phrase of, if I can get those fish feeding, I can get a carp feeding. And carp are very inquisitive. They're very angry, very aggressive feeders. And if I can create a situation where I can draw in a lot of fish into my area, I know that a carp won't be far behind. Obviously, adding naturals to your bait can cause you a little bit more stress when it comes to fishing, because you are going to be a little bit more active. But just by putting a small amount into your mix, even on a day where you wouldn't believe you'd get a carp off the bottom, or you wouldn't even get a bite off of a carp because there's so many little fish over your spot, if there is disturbance on a spot, you will always attract a carp into your area at some point when you have natural bait in your mix. There's 3 types of natural bait that I use. The first being a maggot, the second being a caster, and the third being a worm. Now, all 3 of these baits are, like I say, they're natural, so they have to be kept fresh. So first and foremost is knowing how to look after them. A lot of people buy maggots, buy casters, buy worms, chuck them in an airtight container, take them fishing a couple of days later, and they smell. I always liken using natural bait. You go and do your week shopping, you buy all your meat, your chicken, your steaks, etc. You leave it on the kitchen side. You wouldn't cook it 3 or 4 days later and expect it to taste fresh. You have to keep these baits perfectly fresh in the right environment. Firstly, the maggot. Now, I always liken looking after maggots is like looking after a child. They do require quite a bit of attention, and if you take your mind off them or you take your eye off them for a couple of seconds, before you know it, your nice bucket of juicy maggots, they've all escaped and they're crawling all around your van or all around your swim. Now, whenever I'm getting my maggots from the shop, I don't ever get them put into a bait tub. I will always get them put into a bag, have the air taken out of them, tied down nice and tight. So then when I go home, I can put them into my fridge and they're in there, 2-pint bags, ready to rock and roll for when I go fishing. Now, the beauty with having them put inside a bag and having all the air taken out of them is it suffocates them. So when I transfer them from my fridge into my cool box, I know that them bags, provided they're not been open, will last me a good 6 to 10 days, provided I can keep the temperature down within that cool box. Now, when I'm opening up a bag of maggots, I'm pouring them straight into a bucket, giving them a light dusting of either a maize powder or an active powder, and bringing them back to life. Now, even though they have been suffocated for a period of time, they will start to come back to life. But when they come back to life, that is when the problems can start. If the bucket is ventilated at the top, so you can pierce some holes in the top of a bucket, or at this stage you can put them inside a bait tub, when they come back to life, they will start to wriggle and they will start to sweat. If they are inside a bucket that is completely airtight and sealed, over time they will end up wriggling, generating heat, and they'll pop the lid off of the bucket. Now, if the side of that bucket on the inside gets slightly damp, every single one of those maggots will come up out the side and escape. Not only that, if they don't escape, the maggots that are inside the bucket will generate that much heat that they'll make a sort of foam inside the bucket, and they'll turn really nasty, and you'll be able to smell the ammonia. And if it gets that bad, you will feel it on your eyes. Now, you've only got to imagine that if it's doing that to us, why would you want to feed a natural bait that absolutely stinks to high heaven out there to the carp? When it comes to maggot fishing, you want your maggots as fresh as feasibly possible. Now, like I said, if you want to use them fresh and bring them back to life, keep them in a cool box, keep changing the ice packs regularly, or if you can't keep changing the ice packs regularly, do what I do when I'm on long sessions, and that's nip down to the local Lidl or local Aldi, grab a kilo of frozen corn, wrap it inside a towel and put it in the cool box just to keep that temperature down. But if you're looking to fish with dead maggots, the best way in which I found to kill them off is the bags that you get from the shop, simply put them inside the freezer. But again, one thing that I do like to do, and I don't know whether it's just me, but it's something that I've done over the years that I felt it's prevented them turning very, very quickly in the freezer and going black, is when I put them in the freezer, either wrap the bags in newspaper or wrap them in bubble wrap and place them in the center of the freezer rather than at the side. If you place them at the side of the freezer, it's very, very cold. They can get stuck to the side and they can turn the maggot black. When you bring the maggots out and you want to use them, as they start to defrost, they'll turn black, they'll go very, very putrid and horrible straight away. And in my opinion, you're better off chucking them in the bin rather than chucking them in the lake. So that's the maggots. Now onto the caster. Now the caster is the chrysalis form of a maggot, and obviously these are not moving, they're maggots that have turned, but in my humble opinion, the caster is probably the best natural bait. They're naturally crunchy, they're full of natural aminos, but again, just like the maggots, they can be very, very tricky to keep. Now, when you get the casters from the shop, they normally come in pint bags, they're vacuum sealed bags, they've had all of the air taken out of them, and this is for one vital reason. Soon as you've opened that bag or you've made any form of cut into that bag and air can get into it, the casters will start to turn. They'll turn black, they'll go very, very light in feel, and they will all just float away. Casters, like I say, can be a devastating bait, but they can turn in the blink of an eye. Now, the way in which I like to use casters, first and foremost, if I'm putting them in a cool box, and this is quite an important tip this, if I'm fishing with casters and I'm taking them from my fridge and I'm putting them in my cool box, I will never, ever, ever put an ice pack directly from the freezer straight on top of them. I will always wrap it in a towel. Now, it might only seem something that's small, but if a frozen ice pack touches the side of a packet of casters, in my honest opinion, it's turned them, they're frozen, and I won't use them. Some people might say differently, but me, I want it fresh from the fridge and kept as cool as possible whilst I'm fishing. Now, when it comes to actually using casters within your fishing and on your rigs, you won't be able to hair rig a proper caster. You'll have to hair rig a fake caster. And the way in which I like to do this is tie one off on top of a wafter or on top of a piece of plastic corn. So when it comes to actually using them in the spod mix themselves, obviously they will be a great addition to any spod mix, but the big question is, and something that I've learned over the years, much like I said about keeping them fresh, it's keeping them fresh in the packet once you've opened the packet. Now, there's two ways in which you can do this. First and foremost, once you've opened the packet and air's got into them, tip out the casters that you want and then firmly tie the bag back up. Take all the air back out, give it a twist, fold it over, and either wrap a bit of tape or an elastic band around to stop air from getting to those casters. Another way to keep casters, and a really good way of skimming the floaters out, because every now and again you will get the odd floater inside a packet of casters, is once you finish using the casters that you want to use, empty the contents of the caster packet into a bucket of water. What this will do is it will keep the casters fresh, it will stop them from turning, and all the ones that have turned will float to the bottom, and you can simply scoop them out, remove them, and then when you want to put more bait out, the casters are fresh and ready to go. Right, now on to worms. Now, worms have become increasingly fashionable over the past few years. I first started using them would have been 7 or 8 years ago, and I don't even know what made me want to use them. I think I'd watched a video of a match angler and he'd caught a few carp on worms fishing in a match, and I thought, I wonder if I applied those to my carp fishing, if they would work. Now, when I first got a bag, I simply took them out of the packet, undone the bag, chopped them up, put them out, left them in my bucket at the front of the peg, carried on using them. Now, I caught almost instantly by adding them into the mix, but as the session went on, I stopped catching. Now, over the years now, looking back, I know why I stopped catching. Worms have the most richest amino acid of all natural bait that is going. It is got a fish pulling attractor in it like nothing else. But if they are used incorrectly and they are allowed to sweat inside a bucket or they start to turn, they can be the best attractor in the world. But when they start to turn, they can be the biggest repeller. Now, of all of the natural baits, worms are by far the dirtiest one to use, purely and simply because they come in soil. Now, the soil is always a massive talking point amongst a lot of anglers. People say you should use the soil, other people say you shouldn't use the soil. Now, over the past, like I say, 7 odd years of using worms, for my fishing, I take all of the soil out. I don't want the soil in them worms at all. And the reason for that is the worms have got so many natural aminos inside. If you chop those worms up and add them to the soil, or you put the soil in as you're chopping them up, all of those aminos are being held in the soil. Now, as soon as you're throwing that into the water, whether it's by a spawn, by a boat, or if you're baiting up by a pole or whatever, that soil holds all those natural aminos. They're being washed away in the current of the lake, and none of the natural aminos are getting down onto the bottom of the lake where you want the fish to be feeding. So me, as soon as I got a bag of worms, I'm taking the worms out, riddling them off, and I'm chopping them up, and I'm using fresh as I go, and I am not leaving them in a bucket for hours on end to sit there and ferment and fester in a bucket. Another thing when it comes to using worms, and this again is something that I've learned, and it's something that's cost me quite a few rows with the missus, is keeping the worms. Now, a lot of people would expect to keep worms inside a fridge, keep them nice and cold, and they're going to be as fresh as possible. But what actually happens is when you've got a bag of worms, what you'll find is when you open the bag, if you're quick, you can part the soil and almost pick up the whole entire contents of the worms in one handful, because they ball up very, very tightly. But what they do when they're kept too cold is they actually sweat. And believe me, when worms turn, they are absolutely disgusting. It's the worst smell possible. So how I like to keep the worms, when they get delivered to me, damp newspaper on the floor. I've got a little bit of an outbuilding where I live, but if you've got a garage, you can do it in a garage. Little bit of damp newspaper on the floor, and simply lay the bags on top of that. Worms are best kept around 10 degrees. Don't get me wrong, if it's a bit warmer than that, it's not going to be a problem, but I wouldn't recommend putting them in the fridge and dropping the temperature right down to a couple of degrees. You need to keep worms at a steady 10 degrees if you can. Now, that's all the natural baits that I use, and one last thing, and the biggest piece of advice I can give, is when you come to using natural baits in your mix, don't leave them made up in your mix. Make the mix as you go. I say this in so many of my videos, and I'm sure a lot of the time people believe that I'm not actually doing it. If I'm making up a big bucket of mix, if I'm fishing with hemp, sweet corn, mulched up boilies, I'll make that and I can put that at the front of the peg. I can keep turning it over. Everything's hydrated, everything's ready to rock and roll. But when it comes to natural baits, as soon as you put the lid on them and you seal the bucket, there's no air in there, they're going to start to sweat, they're going to start to ferment, they're going to start to turn. And like I said before, as much as natural baits are probably one of the best pulling attractors for a carp, if they start to turn, they can be horrible and putrid. So what I would always say is, as soon as you put your natural baits into your bucket, put those out into the water, take them back to the cool box, keep them in the cool box, keep them nice and cool. Like I said before, exactly the same theory with the shopping. You wouldn't come fishing and you wouldn't leave the lid off of the cool box with your food in it, so you certainly shouldn't be doing it with your naturals. You would not want to be eating your food a couple of 3 days in, warm, started to turn and gone off. So why would you expect the carp to eat a natural bait, a natural product, in a form that they probably wouldn't even want to go anywhere near it? So keep your naturals as fresh as humanly possible whilst you're on the bank, and I guarantee you it will help you put more carp on the bank. When it comes to quantities of natural bait and how much you use, it's a bit of a common misconception that people think that you should just fill it in with naturals and you're going to catch loads of fish. Now, this is simply not the case. A very, very good match angler, not a carp match angler, a seat box match angler, told me years ago that if you turn up to a venue and the guy next to you's got 10 pints of maggots and you've only got a pint, he isn't going to catch 10 times the amount as what you're going to catch. It is all about how you apply the bait. Now, I liken it almost to putting salt on your chips. Putting salt on your chips, you want to eat every single last chip that's in the box. But if you put too much on there, it can simply become too much. And that's exactly how I look at it when I make a bucket of bait up. I'm always going to use my sweet corn, my hemp, my mulched up boilies. That is my base mix wherever I go. But by adding a sprinkling of naturals, whether that be casters, maggots, or chopped worm over the top, I'm only looking to put a little bit in each time I make a mix, just to give it that little bit of extra pulling power. Aside from that as well, naturals are very, very expensive and it can become very costly, and you certainly don't want to be buying them to wasting them. And on the flip side to that as well, if the fish aren't having it and you do keep piling naturals back out into the lake, the natural bait that you're putting out into the lake almost instantly is turning when you put it out. As soon as you chop the worms up, they're turning. They're a very, very instantaneous bait. If they're out there, they're sitting on the bottom and they're lying dormant, they can act as a repellent, and also as well, if you are putting loads and loads of them in and the fish do turn up, the fish can become so preoccupied on the area that you've baited that it's almost impossible to get a bite because you can't physically fish a small enough hook bait over the top. One other thing, and again, this is a very, very important thing, it's the bottom of the lake that I want to fish my naturals over. Now, certainly when it comes to fishing with maggots, live maggots, if you're fishing anywhere that's silty, that's weedy, where the bottom's very soft, putting live maggots out, believe it or not, they do crawl a lot further than what people think they do. They burrow under the silt. As soon as they're underneath the silt, they're gone. All you've done there is you've bought a load of maggots and you've just put them below the silt where the fish can't find them. So what you need to do is you need to work out the bottom that you're fishing over and choose the right natural bait. If you're fishing over clay, if you're fishing over gravel, yes, maggots are absolutely perfect. If you're looking for a one bite tactic, a solid bag filled up with maggots, no matter where you chuck it, as long as it's not out there for a long time, the maggots aren't going to have had time to completely disappear. But when it comes to casters and worms, obviously a caster isn't going to move anywhere, so you can fish this over any bottom that you want. Now, I have found in the past, fishing very, very silty lakes, that casters are without a doubt the best bait to use, purely and simply because they're very, very light. They sink slowly, they settle down on any substrate, and when the carp come over them, they're always the first thing that the carp will pick up. Now, when it comes to worms, when you chop the worms, yes, they do wiggle, but because you've chopped the worms and you've released all of the aminos, when you're mixing these inside the bait, it can make the bait you're putting out very, very rich. And when you're spomming this bait out there, the aminos from the worms are inside all of the particles of bait, and no matter what bottom that you're putting that over, you're creating a real big area of attraction. But like I say, when it comes to maggot fishing, know the bottom that you're fishing over, because believe me, if it's soft, whether it's the depths of winter or the heights of summer, then maggots will find a way of crawling under the silt and out of the carp sight. Whilst I'm on the subject of baiting, and this is actually a very, very important thing, certainly for those of you guys that fish on lakes that are big, where you can get some form of undertow, is being able to get your natural bait, or any of your bait in general, down to the bottom and knowing how to get it down to the bottom. Now, when you're chopping worms up, obviously they're damp, they're quite heavy, you can mix them into your normal mix, and the weight of that mix will take those straight down to the bottom, like I've already mentioned, taking the soil out of the worms. Now, when it comes to adding casters and maggots to your mix, one thing that I have done a lot in the past is added a little bit more powder into the mix, whether that be an active mix or a bag type mix, and also adding some heavy liquid into it as well. It makes the spom a lot heavier to cast, but what it means is the bait is going out there almost in a clump ground bait ball type consistency, and when it hits the clip, all the little bits and pieces of the powder that have been stuck to the naturals via the liquids that you put in the mix will just make your naturals that little bit heavier, and it means that no matter what the tow's doing, you'll be able to get your bait down to where you're fishing. So I'm sure by now you'd have all seen how I attach a worm to a rig. One thing that's worth noting with a worm is they don't take very well to being pierced with a needle or a baiting needle. They're very, very soft skinned, and if they're threaded down any form of bait floss, any form of braid, and they're tied in a knot, you'll simply split the skin and it isn't a good presentation. So when it comes to fishing worms, putting them on a band is the best possible way. But much like baiting up with naturals, that rig is very, very good provided the bottom is clean. When that rig's cast out into the lake, it acts as almost like an octopus. The worms are going absolutely crazy, and if there's any form of low-lying weed or siltweed on the bottom, or indeed silt, that rig is just going to bury itself. And as great as it is at catching carp, if it buries itself or it gets snarled up in weed, it will just be sat out there dormant, and the rest of the bait that is around that hook bait will simply get eaten and they'll completely miss the rig. So moving on to the maggots. Now, a common question that I get asked is, how do you attach the maggots? There are a few ways. My personal favourite is with the use of bait floss. I don't like using the secondary hook inside a piece of corn and hooking a few on, because it's just an unnecessary object on the rig that I simply don't want on. And the same as a maggot clip, I just don't feel it gives me a good of presentation as what bait floss does. And as well, when you're tying them on with bait floss, you're tying them down in a very, very tight ball. So if there are nuisance fish present in the lake and they pick at the rig, they're not going to be able to pull those maggots off because they're tied so tightly on top of whatever hook bait you're using. On this particular occasion, I'm using them on top of a pop-up. Now, obviously the maggots that I'm using and that I always use on my rigs are always live maggots, so I want them elevated off the bottom. If I'm using them on a D-rig, I use a tall piece of foam, maybe about sort of 10 to 12 mil in length, and I'll tie the maggots off on top of that so the foam keeps the maggots up off of the bottom that I'm fishing over. But in this particular occasion, I'm using a Ronnie rig and I'm tying a couple off on top of a pop-up. So I'm just going to show you exactly how I do that now. So I've got my length of bait floss and I'm simply passing that through the eye of the hook ring swivel like so, grabbing my chosen pop-up, a Cherry Coke special I may add, take one from the pot, and this bit is pretty substandard. This is exactly how I would attach a hook bait if I wasn't using maggots. Thread that on like so, got both of your ends of bait floss up, threading that hook bait down and pulling it down just so the barrel of the swivel covers up the hole. Then what I'm going to do next, and this is quite important, is I'm just going to tie 2 overhand knots on the bait floss and pulling it down like so. And what this does, it just creates a little bit of a buffer for when you put your maggots on and you tie your maggots off. So that's like so. You've got your 2 ends. Obviously, if you wasn't putting any maggots on there, you would snip those ends off, blob it down, and job's a good one. But we're putting maggots on top. Going into my little pot of needles that I've got here. The one here, I have the one with the largest eye on the top now, because even though I'm only youngish, even my eyesight struggles to see sometimes. Grabbing a few maggots. Now, it's worth noting as well that when you are fishing a maggot hook bait over the top of an area of bait that you've put naturals in, a lot of people tend to think that by threading loads and loads of maggots down and creating a big ball is going to get you a bite quicker. But you've got to think, when you're spomming these maggots out, they're not landing in big clumps, so it looks completely alien to the fish. So definitely when it comes to fishing them as a hook bait, less is definitely more. So I've got 5 on there. Again, I'm just going to reference the colour. I'm using mixed maggots. It divides so many people, whether whites are better than reds or reds are better or bronzes are better. Me personally, mixed maggots, keep them guessing. They all taste the same when they crunch them up. They're all loaded, full of attraction. Got those on there like so. I'm going to get the end of my bait floss on one side, I may add, not on both sides, just on the one side. Thread that through the needle, double it back on itself, and I'm just going to slide the maggots down onto that piece of bait floss like so. Remove the needle. Remember to keep it somewhere safe. You don't want to be sat on your bed chair and then that goes inside you. Pulling them down to the top of the pop-up, and then it is a case of simply tying 4 or 5 overhand knots to secure these maggots in place. You don't want to pull the first one down mega tight, because you will pull and pierce the maggots and pull them off of the actual bait floss itself. Once you've done the first couple, simply couple of overhand knots to secure it in place, and then all I'm doing then is I'm going to take a pair of scissors and I'm just going to trim the tag ends off, leaving a tiny little bit, making sure not to cut the maggots. Remove them like so, and there you go. We've got 5 maggots on top of a pop-up. Now, what I will do with this is, I know that this pop-up will be over buoyant for this rig. I don't add any additional weight, as I've already said before in previous videos, but I'll take it to the water's edge and I'll trim this pop-up down, but I'll trim it down so when I've trimmed it, the pop-up is still sat off the bottom. Now, the reason why I will trim it till it's just sat off the bottom is because the weight of the maggots and the water that will attack the pop-up will naturally bring that hook bait down onto the lake bed. So I'll almost put it out as neutrally buoyant, critically balanced. So over the course of time, maybe in half an hour to an hour, that bait will sink and settle right down on the bottom, and it will mean that that hook bait is as light as possible. Now, I know people are probably thinking, well, what if you get a bite within the first half an hour, will it not put the fish off? Absolutely not. A hook bait that's hovering around, that's very, very light when fishing over naturals, is by far the best presentation that you can possibly have, which is why when you're fishing with foam on a D-rig, I can be sometimes very peculiar and quite particular with the length of foam and the amount of maggots that I put on, because I had a really, really good session back last winter where I was experimenting for a long, long time, and I was putting really long rigs out with pieces of foam and just 4 maggots on top, but it was so critically balanced that the hook bait was almost just hovering around just off the lake bed. And like I say, the last thing that I want that hook bait to be doing is to sink down quickly, the maggots go down into the siltweed or the silt that I'm fishing to bury themselves, and it makes that hook bait completely ineffective. So there you go. Tying maggots off on top of a hook bait is a massive, massive edge, but always remember, Don't go putting loads out. The maggots that you're putting out there are not clumping up together. There's going to be a nice bit of separation between them all. You want to put a nice hook bait over the top. That is light, that when the fish are feeding, they can pick it up with ease. Using natural bait by no means is a clean way of angling. Now, whenever I'm fishing with maggots, the one thing that I've certainly suffered more as I've got a little bit older is the ammonia that comes from it. No matter how fresh you try to keep a maggot, maggots grow where stuff rots. So no matter how clean you think your maggots are, there's always that level of ammonia inside them. And when you're piercing them onto a needle, you're tying them on bait floss and you're spodding them out, if these ammonias go on your hands, and I'm sure some of you guys watching this have probably had it in the past, over time your eyes will begin to water, and that is where the ammonias are attacking you. So I always have a little bottle of this whenever I'm using maggots, just to wash my hands off after. Again, a lot of people will say, oh, the scent of that will put the carp off. I've never heard so much nonsense. It will not put the carp off, but what it will do is it will stop my eyes from watering, and it will mean that I'm not going home from here looking like I've been punched in both of my eyes. And aside from that, if you do have an allergy to ammonia, it's always worth taking a Piriton after you've used them or before you're about to use them, just to reduce the risk of any sort of harm coming to you. Not that it will cause you any major grief, but it will be very irritating, and there's nothing worse than being on the bank and being uncomfortable. So there you go then, that is everything that you need to know about using natural baits in your fishing. Now, one last thing that I will mention is wherever you are taking your natural baits, please always check fishery rules. A lot of the places that I go to, they have various different rules regarding various types of natural baits, but provided you're following the fishery guidelines, you should be absolutely fine. And just remember, if the guy next door to you has got 10 times the amount of naturals as what you've got, it doesn't mean that he's going to catch 10 times the amounts of fish. Know how to look after them, know how to apply them, know how to use them, and I hope you have success using natural baits in your fishing.